welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Earlier this month, Timnit Gebru, the co-leader of a team of researchers at Google specializing in the ethical implications of artificial intelligence, was unceremoniously ousted from her position. Some of the circumstances that led to her departure are disputed, but Gebru, who is a black woman in a field that is overwhelmingly white and male, claims she was forced out for drawing unwelcome attention to the lack of diversity in Google's workforce. She also claims she was silenced for her refusal to retract a paper that she had co-authored on ethical problems associated with certain types of AI models that are central to Google's business. The episode has sparked a fierce backlash across Silicon Valley and beyond, including among current and former Google employees, and it has also generated a new wave of interest in the field of AI ethics. Joining me now to dig into this fascinating topic is Karen Hao. She's the senior AI reporter at MIT Technology Review, where she also co-produces a podcast called In Machines We Trust. And she also writes a weekly newsletter called The Algorithm, both of which you should check out. I should mention to our listeners that we're recording this week's episode on Friday, December 18th, so the ground may have shifted somewhat since then, but we hope you'll find it interesting nonetheless. Karen, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you so much for having me, Elliot.
First, could you tell us a little bit about Timnit Gebru and the kind of stature she has in the AI field, given the pioneering research she's done and how she wound up at Google to begin with?
Sure. So Timnit is, you could say, one of the cornerstones of the AI ethics field. She got her PhD in AI ethics at Stanford under the advisement of Fei-Fei Li, who is one of the pioneers of the entire field of AI. And when she left her PhD at Stanford, she joined Microsoft for a postdoc, and she ended up at Google because she was actually approached by Google based on work that she had done that was very impressive. As Google was starting their ethical AI team, they thought that she would be a great person to co-lead it. One of the studies that she was known for, or is known for rather, is a study she co-authored with another Black female researcher, Joy Balamwini, on the algorithmic discrimination that appears in commercial facial recognition systems. The paper was published in 2018, and at the time, the revelations were pretty shocking because they were auditing commercial facial recognition systems that were already being sold by tech giants. And the findings of the paper showed that these systems that these tech giants were selling under the premise that they were highly accurate actually were extremely inaccurate, specifically on darker skinned and female faces. And in the 2 years since the paper has been published, there's been like a number of events that have ultimately led these tech giants to take down or suspend the sale of their facial recognition products to police. And the seed of those actions were actually planted by the paper that Timnit co-authored. So she is like this really big presence in the AI ethics field. She has done a lot of groundbreaking work. She also co-founded a nonprofit called Black in AI that really champions diversity in technology and in AI specifically. And she is really like a force of nature and a really well-known name in the space.
What exactly are the ethical issues that Gebru and her co-authors identified in the paper that led to her dismissal?
So the paper was on the risks of large-scale language models. And large-scale language models are essentially these AI algorithms that are trained on an enormous amount of text data. So you can imagine that they're basically trained on like all of the articles that have been published on the internet, all of the subreddits and Reddit threads that have been published on the internet, Twitter, Instagram captions, everything. And they're trying to learn how we construct sentences in English and how they might then be able to generate sentences in English. And what's useful, one of the reasons why Google is very interested in this technology is because it helps power their search engine. in order for Google to give you relevant results when you search a query, it needs to have some, be able to capture or interpret the context of what you're saying, so that if you type in 3 random words, it can kind of gather the intent of what you're looking for. And what Gebru and her co-authors point out in this paper is that this area of research, which is relatively recent, it began in 2017 with a paper that Google had published at the time, is, while beneficial, also has some pretty significant downsides that need to be talked about more in the field. One of them is specifically that these models take an enormous amount of electricity to power because they're run on these really large data centers. And given the fact that we are in a global climate crisis, the field should be thinking about the fact that in doing this research, it could exacerbate climate change and then have downstream effects where climate change is disproportionately impacts marginalized communities in developing countries. Another risk that they point out is the fact that these models are so big that they're very difficult to scrutinize. And they also capture large swaths of the internet that are very toxic. And so they end up normalizing a lot of sexist, racist, or abusive language that is no longer kind of what we want to perpetuate into the future. But because of the lack of scrutability into these models, we aren't able to fully dissect the kind of things that they're learning and then weed those out. So ultimately, the conclusion of the paper is kind of like, there are great benefits to these systems. There are also great risks. And as a field, we should be spending more time thinking about how we can actually develop new language AI systems that don't rely so much on this brute force method of just training it on billions and billions of sentences scraped from the internet.
All very understandable. And how did Gebru's supervisors at Google react to this?
What's interesting is what Timnit has said in her accounts and what has been backed up by her former teammates is that the paper was actually approved to be submitted to a conference. This is like a very classic process, specifically with her team and within the broader Google AI research team. The whole point of doing this research is to contribute to the academic discourse. And the best way to do that is to submit it to an academic conference. So they had prepared this paper with some external collaborators. And they submitted it to this conference for next year, which is one of the premier conferences in AI ethics. And it had been approved by her manager. It had been approved by other people. And then very last minute, after she had submitted the paper, she received notice from superiors above her manager saying that she needed to retract the paper. There was very little that had been revealed to her about why she should be retracting this paper. It was sort of just like an order from above, you need to retract this paper. So she then proceeded to ask lots of questions about who was telling her to retract the paper, why they were asking her to retract the paper, whether or not there could be modifications made to the paper to make it more palatable for submission. And through her repeated questioning, she kept getting stonewalled. And she did not receive additional clarification on what were the circumstances around why she needed to be retracting the paper. And so she ended up sending an email right before she went on Thanksgiving vacation where she said, I am not going to retract the paper unless there are certain conditions that are met. First, I need to know who is giving this feedback. And I need to know what the feedback is. And then I need to have a meeting with her boss's boss and her boss's boss's boss with her team to kind of explain just in general what happened, because the way that they had kind of treated their research was extremely disrespectful and was not the way that researchers were traditionally treated at Google. And she wanted kind of an explanation of why they had done that. And if they did not meet those conditions, she would then have a frank conversation with them about a last date at Google so that she could create a transition plan, leave the company smoothly, and then publish the paper outside of the Google context. And then she went on vacation, and then in the middle of vacation, one of her direct reports texted her and said, "We just received an email that Google has accepted your resignation."
Wow. It's almost the equivalent of President Donald Trump firing his cabinet secretaries by tweet, not even talking to them directly about it, but just sending a message to other people to let them know that they've been fired.
Yeah, it's there are many things that are shocking about this story, but I think one of the more shocking things for me when I was listening to her account of this is the fact that they didn't talk to her directly, and they didn't talk to her manager either. So what happened was she received this message from one of her direct reports. Of course, she immediately panicked because she was like, "I didn't resign." What do you mean? What do you mean they accepted my resignation? So then she messaged one of her other direct reports and was like, "Did you receive this email as well?" And then the other direct report was panicking and said, "Yes, I received this email. I didn't know what to make of it." And then she messaged her manager, and her manager was like, what do you mean? Like, I didn't hear anything about this. And so then it was just a huge confusion of what is going on, who is saying that I've resigned, and once it became clear that it was serious because she had been cut off from her corporate account immediately, that's when she announced on Twitter, "It seems like I've been fired." And then it sparked a huge debate from there.
So one of the things about this story that has made it a little hard to follow from a lay reader's perspective is that there are different and sometimes contradictory accounts of her dismissal from Google's side. So what is their side of the story exactly?
So Google has sort of said a couple things that contradict what Timnit has said. The first one is they said she resigned, which is a very interesting. I don't know. They haven't given any additional facts that kind of contradict her account, but they contradict her interpretation. So she said, based on these events, it seems like I've been fired. And they were like, based on these same exact events that we haven't contradicted, you resigned. So that's the first thing that they've continuously asserted. Every time I've reached out to them for comment, they've sort of just repeated, just remember, she resigned, she wasn't fired. The other thing that they said was her paper, when it was submitted to internal processes for review before being submitted to a conference, she had submitted it supposedly late. She had submitted it one day before the deadline. And Google says that the traditional process is you need to submit it at least 2 weeks before the deadline for review. This has been heavily contested by members of her team as well as former Google employees who said that, first of all, the internal policy does not say anywhere this 2 weeks timeframe, but also that many researchers often submit to internal processes for review after they've submitted it to a conference, and they've never received any backlash about that, just because of the volume of papers that are produced by Google researchers. There isn't really like a strict, robust internal review process. The last notable thing that Google has said is the paper did not meet Google's bar for publication. And even though the paper was not being published, it was being submitted to a conference, which is different. They feel as a company that they should be holding themselves to a standard that is equal to the rigor of a peer-reviewed publication. And so the two things that they give as examples for why Timnit's paper didn't meet the bar for publication is, one, they didn't cite a lot of recent work on mitigating bias in language models, despite the fact that they criticize models for having that embedded bias. And then the second one was the work that has been done to kind of mitigate the electricity costs of these models, despite the fact that they say that there's enormous electricity costs to it. What is notable is their paper has 128 citations, which is 5 to 6 times more citations than the average paper that is usually submitted to a conference. And when I talked with Timnit, she had mentioned that they had actually gotten feedback from dozens of people, and they had bucketed it in, people who might disagree with them, people who work on large language scale models, people who use large language models, to actually try and get as broad of a cross section of opinions and research as possible. And the people that were writing this paper, they themselves are some of the premier experts in the bias in algorithms. So both she and many of her former teammates just think it's very, very strange that Google would specifically emphasize that they were missing literature in their realm of expertise.
That's also something other Google employees have contested, right? The fact that Google never before rejected a paper because of an inadequate literature review.
Yes, there was a tweet from Google, I believe a current Google researcher, who said, I have only ever been asked to modify my paper on the basis of revealing potentially proprietary information of Google's, never ever on the basis of the comprehensiveness of my literature review.
So you had a chance to interview Gebru recently, as you mentioned. How's she handling all this?
She has been, overwhelmed, but also I think she just hasn't really had time to process it, because she was fired on vacation when she was supposed to be, actually spending time with her family during Thanksgiving. And then, of course, immediately when she tweeted out that this had happened, there was this huge backlash that started happening against Google. And she started being overwhelmed with media requests. And then 4 days later, she needed to attend a huge AI research conference, which is one of the annual AI research conferences. And it runs for 6 days. So she when I talked to her, she said that she had just been going, and she hadn't slowed down, even though she no longer had a job. She was still working on this paper and trying to address the feedback, trying to field these media requests, and also continuing to participate in the AI research community and going to workshops at this conference. She spoke on a panel, connecting with younger researchers, because one of the roles that she's always played is being a really big mentor and advocate for young researchers of color, and particularly Black researchers. And so she's been doing that. And she said to me when I spoke to her, at some point when all of the momentum dies down, she says she feels like she'll probably finally break down, but she's kind of been holding it together based off of all the adrenaline of this.
I had a chance to listen to that conversation you had with her, and she mentioned something interesting, which was that this episode has so many different issues intertwined in it. AI ethics, obviously, but also research censorship, academic freedom, labor rights, the persistent issue of a lack of diversity and inclusion in the tech sector. I'm wondering as well how much of a role you think was played by the fact that the paper that Gebru and her co-authors were working on really struck at the core of what Google and other tech giants see as the foundation of their ability to continue growing and increasing their revenues. As you said, that this is technology that is really going to power the main moneymaker for Google in the future.
I think it definitely plays a part in it. How much it plays a role in that, it's a little bit unclear. I think initially when superiors at Google rejected the paper and said that she had to retract it, I'm sure it very, very much had to deal with the fact that it was criticizing this technology that is core to Google. What happened after that, the fact that she was dismissed based off of this, I think has to do with more than just the paper. I think it also has to do with the fact that she was very vocal at Google about the lack of diversity that Google had. And she pushed back a lot, both internally and externally, about the fact that Google paid a lot of lip service to increasing diversity in their ranks, and yet only had 3 Black female researchers in hundreds and hundreds of researchers. I mean, no one knows at this point how much each of these factors played a role, but Google themselves, when they wrote the actual email to dismiss her, it did cite both the paper and it cited this email that she had written to an internal listserv at Google, that very a very scathing email that kind of recounted some of the gaslighting that she said that she had experienced through this paper review process and through this retraction order. And yeah, they cited both of them in the dismissal, saying that this email, like, we are unable to meet your requirements around this paper, and in addition, this email is unbecoming of a Google manager, and that's why we have, quote unquote, accepted your resignation.
Even if we accept that it might be true, she's also pointed out that there have been other people who have been fired from Google for much more serious transgressions than she was, and they've been given multi-million-dollar severance packages.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite points from her, which just goes to the... I mean, it's just, it makes you really sad and angry about the amount of racism that is apparent in the way that Google differentially treats different employees. Yeah, she made this really great point that there was this huge sexual harassment lawsuit against a high-level senior executive at Google, and he was dismissed with a $90 million leave package.
Quite the golden parachute.
Yeah, and it is really striking to hear, to juxtapose that example with the way that she was dismissed. She wasn't even told, and her manager wasn't even told, and she had to find out from her direct reports. Like, that's and in the middle of her Thanksgiving vacation. It's just like many layers. So I do think that some people have I've been like reading a lot of the social media comments and other comments that have come out of this, and some people are like, well, if she's been so loudly vocal against Google and in these ways, then like, shouldn't Google have the right to dismiss her because her employment is at will? Like, yes, legally, perhaps Google might have not done anything out of bounds, but the way that they approach dismissing her really does, it's just in such sharp contrast to the way that they've dismissed previous people who are not Black women.
What has the response been from the broader community of people who work in technology in Silicon Valley, academics and civil society groups that study AI and its implications? What's their reaction been broadly to this whole saga?
There's been an overwhelming outpouring of support from these people for Timnit. Partly, I think this shows how much she... I think a lot of the coverage around Timnit has really focused on the fact that she was the co-author of this groundbreaking paper that focused on that revealed discrimination in facial recognition systems, and on a lot of her other research accomplishments. One of the things that I think is underplayed is she also has this incredible ability to build community. She started, like I said, this nonprofit, Black in AI, and Black in AI is now one of the key organizations that gathers not just Black researchers, and cultivates Black research, but also gathers civil rights activists, AI ethicists, people who really care about making AI beneficial for everyone. And it's become a model that's been replicated throughout the AI field with other affinity groups. So based off of the Black in AI model, there's now queer in AI, Latinx in AI, disabilities in AI. So I think the fact that there was such a huge outpouring really demonstrates how much she had invested in building these communities, and like really fostering this kind of discourse and mentoring people, helping people. And that's why so many people then rushed to come to support her, because they were like, we've directly benefited from so much of her work and her community building and her research, that it seems a little bit outrageous that Google is now saying saying things that question her research abilities and question, her character. And so at this point, there was like a petition that's been going around that like hashtag I stand with Timnit. And I think at this point there are over 7,000 signatures or thereabouts on the petition from employees in Google and civil rights activists, AI ethicists, other AI researchers outside of Google that have really rallied to defend her.
How much of the new research in this field of AI ethics would you say is coming out of the big tech companies like Google?
It's hard to quantify, but it's an overwhelming amount. I can say from my own reporting, because I exclusively cover AI, that I don't know, maybe 6 to 7 out of 10 research papers that I cover are from big tech companies. Perhaps it's even higher. I'm not even sure, but it's just an overwhelming amount, because the funding for the field comes from these tech giants. And even if you work in academia, you very likely will end up getting funding from tech giants anyway, because the amount of money that it costs to actually do this kind of research, such as large language models, is very high. And that was actually another point that the Timnit and her co-authors brought up in their paper, is a like ramification of pursuing this kind of very large scale, expensive research, is that you concentrate all of that research power among the wealthy companies and end up blocking out more impoverished academic labs. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's an overwhelming amount. And a lot of the research that comes out of academia is not only funded by these tech giants, but also many professors now have dual appointments. Many assistant professors and professors have dual appointments where they have one foot in Facebook and one foot in, NYU, or one foot in Google and one foot in the University of Washington. So it's really, these tech giants have really become a core part of the funding fabric and research fabric in the community.
More broadly, what does it mean for the field of AI ethics to have what seems to me like this massive level of moral hazard, where the communities that are most in danger from the impacts that Gebru and her co-authors identified, the environmental ramifications and such, the communities that are most in danger from those impacts are marginalized and often lack a voice in the tech space, while the engineers building those AI models are largely insulated from the risks?
Yeah, I think this gets at the core of what has been an ongoing discussion within the AI ethics community for the past couple of years, which is that Silicon Valley has a conception of how the world works based on the disproportionate representation of a particular subset of the world, aka like usually upper class straight white men. And the values that they have from their cross section of the lived experience have now become somehow the values that everyone needs to live by. But it doesn't always work that way. Like when they make this cost benefit analysis that it is worth creating these very large language models and worth spending all of that money and all of that electricity to get the benefits out of that type of research, it is based on their values and their lived experience. And it might not end up being the same cost benefit analysis that someone might do in a developing country, where they would rather not have to deal with the repercussions of climate change later. And so that was one of the reasons why Timnit was so adamant about making sure that there's more diversity at the seat of the decision-making table. Because if you have more people that have different lived experiences that can then analyze the impact of these technologies through their lenses and bring their voices into the conversation, then perhaps we would have more technologies that do not skew so much their benefits towards one group at the expense of others.
We were talking earlier about how these large language models and AI algorithms more broadly have become such a central part of tech giants' business models. When did that start to become the case exactly? Was it envisioned that way from the beginning? Were people like Mark Zuckerberg and Sergey Brin and Larry Page thinking we're going to gather a ton of data and make these sophisticated algorithms out of it and keep monetizing? Or was it something that kind of came up later on in the process?
I think it was probably less intentional than that. So deep AI, the AI that we know today is actually specifically refers to a particular category of techniques known as deep learning. There are like many different ways that you can build AI, but overwhelmingly what has worked and what people have like doubled down on is the method called deep learning. And deep learning did not become a thing until 2012. So it's like a very recent technology. And at the time, it like started largely in academia, actually. So there were these Fei Li, who was the advisor of Timnit for her PhD. She had this idea that one of the reasons algorithms weren't really working back then was because they didn't have a lot of data. And so she embarked on this really big project to gather all of this data in image recognition. So she coalesced millions of images and then got crowdsourced the labeling of these images in a very detailed methodological way, and then fed it into these algorithms and started this academic competition where teams would compete to see how if they could build image recognition systems based off of this training data set that could perform well. And then in 2012, in the third year of that competition, a professor, Geoffrey Hinton, at the University of Toronto, he like created this deep learning algorithm that ended up outperforming every other algorithm that had ever been used before then, like dramatically. And that moment was when like deep learning became a big thing, and everyone was like, wow, deep learning is the way to go. And so all of these researchers and all of these companies started investing in deep learning and figuring out how can we use deep learning in not just images, but also language and audio, in analyzing video, everything. And so I think it was kind of a little bit unintentional, where like the success of this particular deep learning approach, because it was first, everyone started latching onto it. And when companies realized that this method was making them a lot of money, they then continued to invest in it and continue to grow the models, continue to get more data, compile more data, and train these models in that way. So it wasn't, it's not exactly like a group of people got together and were like, we are going to pursue this in this way and it's going to make us a lot of money, mwahaha. It's more like they like realized, they kind of like stumbled into it, and then they were like, oh, this is great, let's keep going. And now 8 years later, we're in this place where we've gone a little bit too far.
So what distinguishes deep learning is essentially the size of the data sets that are being fed into the model, which allows them to learn at breakneck speeds?
The current state of the art, yes. Deep learning, the literal definition of deep learning actually has nothing to do with the amount of data. It just refers to the type of software that's used, or the type of algorithm that's used. But at the moment right now, these algorithms work best when there is a massive amount of data. There are efforts, though, to make like deep learning algorithms that work on very small amounts of data. We just haven't yet seen enough success in those methods for them to actually be useful to companies.
So looking ahead, what needs to happen for the ethical concerns that Gebru and her colleagues have been laying out to be taken more seriously? Is it time for regulators to step in and basically force some changes in the industry, or does there need to be a deeper cultural shift in a lot of these tech companies?
I think it's both. I think it needs to be bottom up and top down. I think we've gotten to a point now where it's kind of clear that tech companies can't self-regulate. And when I spoke with Timnit, she said the same exact thing. It's like, we've already given them a chance to do the right thing and they haven't really done the right thing. And whether or not that's because of malintent or negligence, or the fact that, without regulation, they're only going to ever pursue existing incentives and not like invisible incentives, aka like make sure that their shareholders are happy. It doesn't really matter, but what's clear is that there's just a gap in the incentive structure that tech companies operate under, and we need to fill that gap with regulation. I hope that in a funny way, this particular moment has helped increase the momentum in those regulatory conversations, because before, like I've been covering this space for a little over 2 years, and there really were like, this is like the first time that like we're seeing AI ethics as like a main thing that's being covered by all of the mainstream media outlets. And so I'm hoping this is a bit of a rallying moment of, okay, this is important. This affects all of us. It's time to actually do something to set that, to adjust the perverse incentive structures in a more set in stone way.
We've all had to dramatically increase our lexicons, I can say, from personal experience, and learn new words like deep learning and things like that.
Yeah, I'm hoping that now that more people are starting to learn about this stuff and starting to learn these terminologies, that there will be more scrutiny paid to things that have kind of been bubbling under the surface.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like there's some very powerful people in Washington paying attention now, doesn't it?
Yeah. So one of the exciting things is there was a letter. There were 9 members of Congress that, after all of this coverage came out, ended up sending a letter to Google, specifically asking them about the circumstances around Timnit's dismissal. And one of the things that they explicitly say in this letter is, we are watching you. We are watching you, and we are thinking carefully about how to write legislation that holds tech companies accountable and specifically holds them accountable for the algorithms that they build and deploy. And what's notable about the 9 Congress members that sent this letter is 2 of them, the 2 people that co-led the letter, they previously have introduced quite a lot of legislation, quite a lot of bills into Congress on how to regulate AI and make sure we mitigate the harm so that we can enhance the benefits. One of them was the Algorithmic Accountability Act that they introduced as a bill in 2019. And one of them was a deepfakes bill that was trying to also tackle a different algorithmic harm. And so they're very educated about like AI and data-driven systems and the harms around them, the technical details around how these systems work. And the fact that they sent a letter saying like, we are watching you, means that they've continued to really examine and scrutinize this issue and are probably getting ready to introduce some more bills soon.
And who are these members that you're referring to?
One is Representative Yvette Clarke, who is a congresswoman that represents Brooklyn 9th District, I believe. And then the other one is the Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. And then there were 2 notable co-signers on the bill, Senators Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren.
Fascinating. Well, we'll be looking closely to see what happens, and I'll mention to our listeners that you can read all of Karen's coverage on this topic at technologyreview.com. Karen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Elliot.
Karen Hao is the senior AI reporter at MIT Technology Review. She's the co-producer of the podcast In Machines We Trust, and she also writes a weekly newsletter called The Algorithm. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is at WPReview. I'm at Elliot Waldman with 2 L's, 1 T, and Peter is at PETERDOERRIE. Thanks for listening.